The origami crane, a symbol of peace and happiness. How wholesome. And then there's the Ki-43 Hayabusa, a plane that tried to fly like an origami crane, but ended up drenched in the blood of both invaders and freedom fighters. Spoiler alert, this one didn't quite make it into the peaceful category. Meet the Ki-43 Hayabusa, Imperial Japanese Army's peregrine Falcon. This thing was awkward, like a kid at prom whose date ditched them. Critics of the Zero at least had some sympathy. After all, it was a carrier-based fighter, and it's unfair to compare it with land fighters. But the Hayabusa? Nah, no excuses here. It was meant for the land and still couldn't outperform the Zero. The poor Hayabusa just couldn't catch a break. It's almost like they made a bet. Can we make something that flies but just barely? Somehow they succeeded. Yet, despite its flaws, there were a few occasions where it performed better than the Zero, like in Burma. But let's be real, that's like being the fastest snail in a slow race when facing the sky full of P-51s, P-47s, and Hellcats. So what is this blood-soaked devil that ended up as Japan's second most produced fighter? Well, it's a plane with just 2 guns. That's right, 2. Because when you're going to war, minimalism is key, right? Let's be honest, designing the Ki-43 Hayabusa wasn't exactly a stroke of genius. Our friend Yasushi Koyama, the man behind the design, wasn't aiming to reinvent the wheel. He just wanted to replace the Ki-27, like Mitsubishi replaced the A5M with the Zero. But the Army Air Force saw what was happening over in Europe and realized, oh great, those guys have retractable landing gears now. We can't get left behind. So between 1937 and 1938, they decided to plan 3 different kinds of fighters. One for dogfights, light and agile, one for interception, fast and heavily armed, and another for doing a bit of everything. Why have one fighter when you could confuse everyone by designing 3, right? They handed out the research contracts, and somehow Nakajima ended up winning both light and heavy categories. Some people say they were favored, but hey, we didn't exactly see any other companies lining up to fight for this job. So, in December 1937, Nakajima was handed a contract to develop a replacement for the Ki-27, and thus began the great experiment called the Ki-43, intended to be a combination of interceptor and escort fighter. Its requirements: a max speed of 500 kilometers per hour, reach 5,000 meters in 5 minutes, a combat range of 800 kilometers, and, wait for it, the same armament as the Ki-27. It's almost as if they thought, you know what, let's set goals almost as ambitious as the Zero. What could possibly go wrong? Well, spoiler alert, the answer was everything. Nakajima's approach was, let's say, economical. Instead of inventing something brand new, they just made the Ki-27 bigger. Except Koyama didn't have the experience of the Mitsubishi genius Jiro Horikoshi. The materials weren't as good, and the design wasn't as sophisticated. It's like showing up to a Formula One race in a go-kart and expecting no one to notice. The early 2-bladed propeller Hayabusa fell behind the Zero by 40 kilometers per hour in speed. And it showed. But hey, one thing the Hayabusa had going for it was being sturdier than the Zero. Plus, it got self-sealing fuel tanks. The early ones could stop a 7.7 millimeter bullet, and the later models could handle 12.7 millimeter rounds. Supposedly. Not that it mattered much on the battlefield. Oh, and the firepower. Spoiler alert, it sucked. Early versions had two 7.7mm machine guns, which isn't exactly what you'd call terrifying. Later on, they tried to spice things up with a 12.7mm gun, but even by the end, it was still just two 12.7mm guns. They finally slapped on 20mm cannons by the Model 3, but by then, the war was basically over. Oh yeah, and aiming? The early Hayabusa used a telescopic sight because apparently they wanted pilots to pretend they were birdwatching. It wasn't until the Model 2 that they got a proper reflector sight. Real cutting-edge stuff. For 1939. On December 12, 1938, the prototype flew for the first time. Reactions were mixed. Some said it couldn't meet requirements, others complained it felt stiff, unresponsive, and was just plain heavy. And the landing gear? Yeah, good luck getting that to work properly. Apparently, Nakajima even built a version of the Ki-27 with retractable landing gear as a backup plan. Talk about lack of confidence. The army was like, do we really need this thing? But Nakajima was like, we're all in now, no turning back. They'd put so much money into this project that they basically begged their way through every setback. And by 1940, the army still hadn't accepted it. But when they realized they were about to fight over a giant ocean, they had a change of heart. The Zero had the range for the job, and the Hayabusa could almost manage with drop tanks. So they figured, why not? Let's give it a shot. The pilots had to learn how to make use of vertical maneuvering to compensate. If you couldn't outturn the enemy, you could at least try to outclimb them, or hope they messed up first. By January 1941, they finally approved it, and in May, it officially became the Ki-43 Hayabusa. Armed with a couple of machine guns and a telescope, it went off to war, ready to be the hero Japan neither wanted nor deserved. Ah, the Ki-43 Model Y, the graceful paper crane that tried to be a Falcon, with its Ha-25 engine pushing a stunning 950 horsepower. It came equipped with a fixed-pitch wooden two-bladed propeller and armament that might as well have been slingshots. The A variant had two 7.7mm machine guns. Then they thought, let's spice it up a little, adding a 7.7mm and a 12.7mm gun in the B version, and eventually, drumroll, two 12.7mm guns for the C version. Don't all rush to get scared at once. With a whopping wingspan of 11.4 meters and a max takeoff weight of about 2.2 to 2.6 tons, yeah, that's about the same weight as a half-packed minivan. The max speed was 490 to 495 kilometers per hour. You could also stick two 15 or 30-kilogram bombs under it for good measure, but don't expect too much in the explosive department. Ki-43 Model 2. So while the Zero was trimming its wings, Nakajima thought, why not try that too? The Hei 115 engine gave it 1,130 horsepower, and they threw in a three-bladed metal propeller because, why not? They also went full fancy with 12.7mm guns for all versions, and even slapped a reflector sight on it. And the cherry on top? A 13mm steel armor plate behind the pilot's seat. Sure, it only weighed 48 kilograms, but it made everyone feel safer. Kind of. They trimmed the wings down to 10.8 meters. Max takeoff weight stayed at around 2.6 tons. Yes, they were determined to keep that minivan aesthetic. Speed? Now we're talking 515 to 555 kilometers per hour. They even made it capable of carrying 250-kilogram bombs, if they ever found something worth bombing. Later on, as Nakajima moved on to better things, Tachikawa took over production. They were told, "Hey, make more of these." And they did, like 1,100 of them by the end of 1944. And guess what? They sent them straight into Japan's final stand. Now to the thrilling Ki-43 Model 3. This time, they just gave it an upgraded Ha-115-2 engine to push 1,190 horsepower and called it a day. It still topped out at 555 kilometers per hour with an empty weight over 2 tons and maxing out over 3 tons. But even the A variant still had just 2 machine guns. I mean, why ruin a classic, right? The early versions of the Ki-43 Models A and B were shipped off to the Akino Army Flying School. You know, the perfect place to train rookies. Because who needs reliable equipment when you have students who need excitement? Then they shipped 40 Model C units to the 59th and 64th Squadrons. And that's when the Pacific War kicked off. With a top speed below 500 kilometers per hour, the Ki-43 was hardly the cutting-edge Falcon they claimed it to be, more like a pigeon with a headwind. Alongside the fixed-gear Ki-27, another fine choice for inspiring terror, they set off to Burma with a mix of bombers and some other planes we won't bother remembering. Did it work? Kinda. They gave F-2A Buffaloes a tough time and sent some P-40s back home with their tails between their legs. In Rangoon at the end of 1941, they lost 2 Ki-43s for 6 P-40s and 4 Buffaloes for 16 of their own. Not exactly inspiring numbers for air superiority, but hey, at least no one could say they didn't try. Fighting in Burma wasn't exactly a thrill ride. It wasn't like those epic Rabaul or Marianas battles. It was more like cat and mouse, small units playing tag, or nighttime bombing runs while they tried not to drown in the monsoon rains for 6 months straight. Pretty sure Japan's airmen and the Allies were both thinking, how about we just take a break and start up again after the rain? Meanwhile, the 59th and 64th Squadrons chased each other around Malaya and played who has the worst plane with Ki-27s, Buffaloes, and P-40s. No one really won that game. By March 1942, the Ki-43 mostly entered the fight, and oh boy, even at its blistering top speed of 500 kilometers per hour, the Allies still managed to end up in a stalemate, which really says a lot more about the state of the Allied pilots than it does the Ki-43. Then came November 1942, and with it, the Model 2. At last, the Japanese Army had something that wasn't entirely embarrassing. The 64th Squadron eventually swapped out their early models for this one by December 1942, and with the Ki-44 Shoki by their side, they went after P-40s and Hurricanes, and had their fair share of fun bullying B-24s and Blenheims. They even managed an impressive 1-7 exchange rate in March 1943, which was the highlight of their Burma adventure. On August 24th, 1943, the U.S. bombed Hong Kong and lost 57% of their bombers. 7 planes went in, 4 didn't make it back. Then, on September 15th, they decided to bomb Haiphong and upped the loss rate to a staggering 80%. 5 planes went in, 3 got shot down, and 1 was so wrecked it fell apart. By November 14th, the Americans seemed to be on a roll, with 1 squadron losing 50% of their aircraft. 6 planes, 3 not returned. It seems that even with just 2 machine guns, Japanese pilots occasionally got lucky, like hitting a B-24 hard enough to take it down. But all good things must come to an end, and by the end of 1944, things were starting to fall apart. The Allies brought in the big guns, P-51s, Spitfires, P-38s, and P-47s. The Ki-43 couldn't handle it. They tried, they really did, but turns out a pigeon can't fight off an eagle. From 1943 to 1944, it was a mess in Burma for Allies. The Hurricanes and Ki-43s were 24-3. Against the Spitfires, it was 18-16. The P-51s fared 15-12. Even the P-38s were 8-13. Only the P-47s managed a solid 1-0. Once Allies figured out not to dogfight with the Ki-43, things got a bit brighter. From August 1944 to the war's end in August 1945, Japan's Ki-43, Ki-61, and Ki-84 managed to shoot down a total of 14 Allied aircraft across Southeast Asia, including Burma. Meanwhile, the Ki-43 alone lost 47 of its own, not counting the other planes. Basically, the Ki-43 went from agile predator to crashing paperweight, faster than you could say bad tactical decisions. In 1943, the Ki-43 even showed up at Guadalcanal, where they heroically escorted the Japanese army out of there. They managed to shoot down 6 American planes, including a B-17, and even splashed 10 out of 12 Wildcats. Sure, some of the pilots showed off incredible skill, but skill only gets you so far when your plane is basically made of wet paper. By 1943, the Allies had enough of their antics. They hit the Japanese bases so hard, the Ki-43 had to retreat. New Guinea, the Philippines, Okinawa, Japan, they all fell, and the once mighty Hayabusa, reduced to nothing but scrap metal. 1941, the pivotal year where aviation took a huge leap forward. If you grabbed onto that year, you'd have no worries about staying relevant. Unless, of course, you're the Ki-43, which predictably missed that bus entirely. The Zero? It had a good excuse. It was too busy winning in China. The Hayabusa? No excuse, just a tragic combo of army officers bickering and Japan's weak aviation industry. It wasn't just missed opportunities, it was pure incompetence. In 1942, the Model C Ki-43 barely reached 500 kilometers per hour, and let's be honest, the Zero pilots must have been laughing their tails off. At least we're not that bad. Luckily for the Japanese, the Allies were somehow even worse at this stage. The Model 2 finally managed to reach 0 speeds, but it came way too late to matter. What did the Japanese pilots think? For starters, they knew even early Wildcats could give this thing trouble. The Model 2 did get a boost, a whopping 20 kilometers per hour, and added a dual-speed supercharger for high-altitude work. They also shortened the wings to improve roll rates. But even with these upgrades, it's like bringing a knife to a gunfight. Japanese pilots had a saying, "Spitfire? A terrifying opponent. It's tough to keep up under equal conditions." Another quote, "Above 5,000 meters, the Hayabusa is at a serious disadvantage." Basically, if an enemy pilot made the mistake of dogfighting, they had a chance. But if the enemy zoomed away, good luck catching up. And then there's New Guinea, going against P-38s up at 7,000 to 8,000 meters. The Ki-43 stood no chance. In fact, the first squadron even ripped out their armor just to try and improve performance, anything to keep up. In October 1943, the IJA 4th Air Army had to report that the P-38's performance kept improving while the Hayabusa fell behind. Facing the P-47D Thunderbolt, its firepower was almost 5 times that of the Ki-43, and its durability, well, let's not even talk about that. A classic example. In early March 1944 in New Guinea, Captain Takamura Tsuji of the 63rd Squadron nailed a P-47 with everything he had. The Thunderbolt didn't even smoke. The captain's comment? Combat flaps? We pilots never used those useless things anyway. I wish they'd replace them with 20mm cannons. By 1944 to 1945, what was left of the Ki-43 was only useful for its maneuverability. That was its one shining quality, which is the equivalent of saying your old car's only feature is a really great air freshener. The Ki-84 Hayate replaced some Ki-43s, and many pilots were unhappy about the switch. But by the time Leyte Gulf rolled around, even the Ki-61 Haiyan had a 13% dropout rate due to engine issues, and 20% for the Hayate. The Ki-43, just 4% dropout thanks to its simplicity and not much else. Its reliability was at least better than some of its flashier cousins. The Model 3 did improve performance a bit. Some pilots loved it. They could wring every ounce of fun out of the machine. But when it came to firepower, the 2 machine guns just didn't cut it. Intercepting 4-engine bombers was more like a sad joke. The famed Tateo Kato of the 64th Squadron, with 18 confirmed kills, got himself shot down by a Blenheim Fee's self-defense guns while flying a Ki-43. Yeah, not exactly the stuff of legends. Even when they tried mass attacks on bombers, they'd often fail, prompting the Navy to joke, is this thing supposed to shoot down a bomber with 12.7mm machine guns? Eventually, they did manage to down one, and the Navy saluted them, probably sarcastically. There were some successes, like Yamada Morichi of 54th Squadron shooting up a B-24 enough to take it down, or Satoru Anabuki downing 4 or 5 bombers on one sortie, proving that if you got really, really close, you could make something happen. Even against the dreaded Mosquito, the Ki-43 scored a kill, courtesy of pilot Yasuhiko Kuroe, who benefited mostly from the Mosquito crew's overconfidence. And intercepting B-29s? Well, the Model 3's improved high-altitude capabilities helped. Pilot Korono Shoji even managed to down a B-29 by systematically disabling its engines with those 2 pea-shooter machine guns. Persistence, I guess. In the end, the Ki-43 Hayabusa was meant to be a light, nimble fighter, fast enough to do its job. It had self-sealing fuel tanks, it had armor, and yet, when push came to shove, it was more like paper armor. The Zero at least had wing-mounted guns. The Ki-43 had nothing but its agility and a prayer. Once newer planes like the Ki-84 arrived, there wasn't much left for the Ki-43 to do but rely on the skill of its pilots. And, well, hope that the enemy underestimated them. To the Allies, it might have looked like a paper crane, fragile, outdated, and easily torn apart. But in combat, no one was ever going to treat it as harmless. For the pilots who flew it, the Ki-43 was what they had. And they fought with every ounce of skill they possessed, knowing it was probably not going to be enough. The Allies, always ready to take apart the enemy's toys. In July 1943, the Allies got their hands on a Ki-43 Model 1 in Guilin, shipped it all the way to Ohio for some quality poking and prodding. And what did they find? Well, surprise, surprise. Compared to their planes, this thing was a joke. The mystery of the mighty Hayabusa was finally solved. It wasn't so mighty. pilots who flew it did say one thing in its favor: great handling and maneuverability. It made you feel like you and the plane were one, letting you pull off whatever fancy maneuver you wanted, like the world's deadliest acrobat if that acrobat was stuck in the body of a sickly bird. Its stall characteristics? Superb. Its takeoff and landing handling? Great. And don't get me started on turning performance, especially with combat flaps. It was better than the Zero. It could pull off insane stunts at 270 kilometers per hour or even slower. Heck, if you were at 240 to 400 kilometers per hour, you could outmaneuver most threats. And, let's face it, with enough ace skills, even the clunkiest plane can score a kill. But honestly, how do you deal with it? Easy. Dive and run. And if you didn't know that yet, you learned it the hard way. When the Japanese hit Pearl Harbor, the Hayabusa got its trial by fire over Southeast Asia. The British were sending their second-rate European planes, Hurricanes, to the Far East, thinking it'd be easy work. Turns out trying the same tactics as against a Bf-109 didn't work against a plane designed to outturn everything. Result? In a week, 51 Hurricanes turned into a sad little 20. And to top it off, the Allies didn't even know they were dealing with more than just zeros. They kept confusing it with the Zero, calling it 01. As if that makes any sense. One Hurricane pilot summed it up: any attempt to dogfight with a Zero or an 01 equals certain death. Not exactly a motivational speech. These planes were light and nimble, easily slipping behind you like an annoying shadow. If you wanted to beat them, you needed speed and altitude. Zoom down, take your shots, and zoom right back up. If things didn't go well, hug the ground full throttle and pray. You could keep up the fight if you kept your altitude advantage, but that wasn't always an option in the chaos of battle. A Hurricane pilot wrote a comparison report. Above 6,000 meters, the Hurricane had an advantage over the so-called O1. Below that, though, well, you'd better avoid dogfighting. The Hurricane had a dual-speed supercharger, something the Japanese fighters lacked, so they could maintain an edge at higher altitudes. But in the mess of real combat, perfect conditions were rare. And if you found yourself down low in a slow dogfight with a Hayabusa, congratulations, you just made their day. The Ki-43 might have been fragile, but early on it was like a paper crane with teeth, delicate, but still capable of biting if you underestimated it. The Allies learned that the hard way. So, if the Brits were scratching their heads about the Ki-43, the Americans were just trying to figure out if they could shoot it down before the plane fell apart by itself. Between summer 1942 and spring 1945, the U.S. 5th Air Force got plenty of up-close and personal time with the Hayabusa over New Guinea. They must have really hit it off. There's even a little less than 100-page book chronicling the experiences of over 20 American aces. You know, those who managed to take down 5 or more enemies. And what were the stars of the show? The Zero, the Hayabusa, and eventually the Shoki. But the little Hayabusa was mentioned most of all. It's almost like they had a love-hate relationship. So, what were the pilots saying? Well, there were some golden rules if you wanted to survive an encounter. 1. Don't dogfight a Japanese plane. Just don't. Spoiler alert, you'll lose. 2. Hit and run was the name of the game. 3. Keep a speed of at least 400 kilometers per hour and hit them from high altitude. 4. Whatever you do, don't go for a low-speed steep climb. unless you enjoy being a sitting duck. Yeah, we all know that theoretically planes like the P-47 and P-38 were faster, but surprise, reality doesn't always play nice. Imagine you're a lone P-38 pilot, out for a pleasant cruise. Below you, there are 9 P-47s in the middle of an argument with 4 Ki-43s, aka Oscars. Our hero here decides to jump in and help. He says, I'd trained against the P-47 before. I knew they couldn't keep up with my P-38. But in low altitudes, those Oscars are bloody fast, and I knew the P-47s didn't stand a chance of catching them. So, what happens when a P-47 gets jumped by a Hayabusa? They had their own little trick. At around 500 kilometers per hour, the P-47's ailerons were still nice and responsive. Just as the enemy was lining up their shot, they'd half roll, dodge, and maintain speed to keep turning. Meanwhile, the Japanese planes? Oh, they needed Hulk-level strength to work their ailerons at those speeds. Even if they somehow managed to keep up, actually aiming was another issue entirely. Once the P-47s shook them off, it was time for the head-on counterattack. With .50 caliber machine guns that had better range and punch than the Japanese pop guns, many Allied pilots remember seeing the enemy actively avoiding head-on fights after a while. Even the P-40 pilots in the China theater got in on the action, recalling that many Oscars would start a head-on approach only to suddenly chicken out midway and pull up, presenting a perfect target. And the Hayabusa's airframe strength? Well, let's hear it from one P-38 pilot in the South Pacific. There was an Oscar crossing right in front of me, so I lit it up from nose to tail. The plane's skin peeled away like a banana, just flapping back to the tail like strips of tape. It looked like a half-finished model airplane with its skeleton exposed. So, what can we say? If the Zero was remembered by Hellcat pilots as being shot to pieces, then the Hayabusa must have just disintegrated. Unlike the Zero, the Ki-43 wasn't designed to be a cutting-edge marvel that left no room for error. It was more of a let's make do with what we've got situation. It didn't have the advanced materials, nor the intricate design. It even shared the same engine as the Zero, but was still somehow less impressive. But credit where it's due. At least the Hayabusa had self-sealing fuel tanks and armor before anyone else thought it was a good idea, even if that armor was about as useful as a paper shield. In its early days, the Allies viewed it like a deadly little falcon, agile, dangerous, and not to be underestimated. By the end of the war, though, they saw it more like a paper crane, fragile, outdated, and a bit of a joke. But in combat, no one ever treated it like a harmless origami figure. It still had claws, just very, very brittle ones.